Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. Today, I'm going to be talking about action. The whole point of us actually collecting data and having data in our teams and organisations is that we actually do something about it. And it's come up a couple of times lately in conversations that I've been having around, how can we be more strategic? How can we be more intentional with what we're collecting so that we're actually able to focus on what we do with it on the other side? I'm coming out of probably one of the biggest events in my practice thus far. So recently, there has been a big change to a particular type of educational data in Australia. And I'm not going to talk in detail about those changes or about that data set today. But I decided on the back of, obviously I work with a lot of schools and I dig into that data a fair bit. But on the back of these changes to the metrics, I thought, I work with lots of schools. I've worked with probably a couple of hundred schools now since the last lot of information came out. And, this is my day-to-day life, right? I have ideas and ways that I use that data. I look at it in particular ways. And obviously I really want to focus on the action. And as I said, I thought, well, I'll put this webinar idea out to people and I'll just focus on actions. And so I focused on kind of 10 ways that I choose to use that particular data set. And what I guess has transpired is that, as I say, it's one of the most highly attended webinars that I've run. Basically, I just had really good numbers, lots of interest, and lots of my current and former data champions came along as well. So there's obviously a real need to be talking about action. And while I know many of my listeners of this podcast are not in the education space, what it got me thinking about was, what happens when we're told that we have to collect a particular type of data, or we know that a particular form of data that is being collected just exists in our organisations? What do we do when we actually don't have a strategy for the actions? What do we do when we don't necessarily know how it could be tapped into, what's possible with the information that we've got? Because at the end of the day, we actually need to be doing something with it. Otherwise, as always, as I always say, it's a complete waste of time in terms of collecting. And while some of that might be compliance, as is, this standardised assessment in Australia, schools essentially don't have a choice in having their students sit it. Parents have the choice to withdraw their students, but schools actually have to have every student in 4 year levels sit this particular test. And there are 5 tests. And so they get data from 5 assessments on these 4 year levels. Now, the schools don't have a choice in that, but they do have a choice in how they act on the information, and they have a choice as to how they view that whole process of going through that actual collection. I guess where I see the action part falling down is where the views of the people working in the organisation are one of compliance. When we think about compliance and when our mindset is around, I have to do this, or there's an expectation that I will, or I have no choice in whether or not this is collected, we almost shut down thinking about what's possible on the other side of it. And I guess I genuinely believe that we can hold 2 views at the same time. I really believe in pluralistic thinking. I believe that you can fundamentally disagree with the type of data maybe you're collecting. You can disagree with the metrics that are being used. You can disagree potentially with how it's publicised or how it's shared with the community or a wider audience. You can disagree with all of that. And at the same time, you have the capacity and the choice to buy into what's actually possible and what are those good news stories that we can take out of the data. How can we actually use it to help our practice? How can we use it to help serve the people that we're actually, here to serve in the first place? In my own practice, I think about the data that I have coming out of, I use Xero as my accounting software, and I think about some of the financial reporting that's possible in Xero. And as somebody who, has never really been in a role where I had a budget to manage, but I wasn't in charge of multiple budgets, I'd never really used a budget variance report before. And that was something that was really new to me. It was something that obviously Xero does. creates or can create a budget variance report if you have set up a budget in the first place. But I didn't know what was possible. And the way that I guess it's a key part of my practice, it's a key part of the way that I kind of track the progress and the spending in my own practice, was that I actually had to get training. I had to have somebody show me and explain to me why it was potentially going to be useful. And then I had to learn how to actually set it up and how to run the report, and then to think about, well, what do I actually do with that information? So my mindset shifted, and that's the real thing about compliance. Like that data and that information was already kind of sitting in Xero in the back end because I code all of my expenses, but I didn't know what was possible in terms of, like, say, comparing it to a potential budget. So for me, that first part's around mindset. So shifting from compliance, this has to be done, it just exists, to, okay, there's actually some potential here, there's some possibility, and it could potentially bring some value to me. And what that took was actually somebody else pointing that out. So sometimes in your work and with the data that you've got available, there would be people that you work with, hopefully, that view it more positively than you, and can think about ways and opportunities for you to use that information and put it to work so that it actually serves you. And so, as I said, you can focus on action. Oftentimes people kind of ask where I go for help with any of the key data sets or interpretation or understanding them a little bit more. And YouTube's a really good place to start. So if you are looking for a bit of training or explanation about the different metrics that you've got, I'd really encourage you to jump online. There's so many resources available. Even I find it extraordinary on YouTube that there can be a significant variation in length of video on the same topic, like from 2 minutes to an hour. So I always go on the shorter end. I figure if you need to say something that's important and if you can't say it in a couple of minutes, then you're probably not doing a very good job of it. So even at a superficial level, going on and watching a couple of really short videos to help understand not only what the metrics are and the data sets are, but how they can potentially be beneficial in your business or in your team, that would be a really good place to start. And in a way, that's kind of, for me, what happened with my Xero budget variance report. I had somebody talk me through what was possible, and then they actually showed me so I could start to see some examples of it. Now, for me, that has sat there for a few months, right? So I set up my budget and it's been interesting. I've been tracking the metrics over time. And even though I'm the data person and I focus on action with data, to be honest, I didn't really know much about action. I hadn't really thought about, well, what do I do? I could see, say, some of my expenses were going up, particularly my domestic travel, and I kind of felt that it was out of my control, that there wasn't really much that I could do. So for you, it's firstly about shifting mindset and understanding what's possible. It's about learning about the different metrics and the tools that you've got access to. But then the third one is to think, well, what do I actually do with that information now that I've got it? Because in my case, there's no point in me setting up a budget in Xero. There's no point in me running budget variance reports once a month or once a quarter or whatever it might be, if all I'm going to do is look at the information and go, yeah, right, that's interesting. So what is possible? Interestingly, I watched a webinar of a friend of mine. He ran a session on this recently, and he shared a session with me, and it was all about profit, and it was about reducing expenses, and there's a range of different levers that he talks about that you can kind of pull to tweak your expenses and your profit. And that was actually really useful for me. So I think he gave about 15 different possible ways that you could maximize income and reduce expenses. And from that list of 15, I kind of walked away from that webinar and I thought, okay, well, what are 5 ways that I could potentially influence my profit in my business? So I walked away with those 5 examples, and then I thought, okay, well, I actually need to do something with this now. So what that has done is that's now given me some strategies. So I have 5 strategies, and I thought, okay, well, I can, choose to ignore it. I could. That's one thing I could do. But actually the people, I've got somebody in my team who can not hold me accountable, but, she spends money in the same way that I do in my practice. And so we had a conversation about those 5 levers. And it was actually really useful to sit down and collaborate. And one of the things that we know about effective use of data is that collaboration is really powerful, and that we want to get multiple brains together to talk about what's possible and how we act on the information. And so what I did was I thought about those 5 kind of levers, and I sat down with her and we kind of unpacked where I felt my biggest cost centers were, what was possible, what we could make tweaks to. And the really nice thing that I liked about my friend's presentation was that he was kind of saying, how do you just get 5% better? Like, how do you just make 5% more profit? And so for me, there was change that felt manageable. It felt like it was in a size that I could tackle. And he provided some strategies for how I could do that. So then sitting down with my practice manager, we were able to kind of go, okay, well, what is possible? And she came up with some great ideas that I never would have thought of. And so I was kind of given all of these little crumbs along the way that I followed to think about how I can act on it. And then we've started to put some of those things in place. And I'm starting to see, a little bit of an impact. So really, in my practice, really small things like we charge a flat rate of postage on my website if somebody buys a book of $5 Australian at the time of recording. Now, that doesn't make sense financially because it actually costs us more than $5 to post the book. And so, even making small tweaks like aligning our postage with the Australia Post, like standard rates, makes sense to that bottom line. And it won't be the thing that is a 5% change, but there'll be a bit of a change, and that's going to make a difference. And then the two of us have agreed to kind of sit down once a quarter and go through it and check, are we on track? What's it like compared to last quarter? What's it like compared to this time last year? And the reason I'm kind of sharing this is because I've gone from that process of there's data that's being collected automatically by my accounting software into I've been able to work out how to action that information really powerfully. And it's been really useful. And that's the challenge and the problem that I often see in teams that I work with. So I guess my questions for you this week are, what are those data sets that you need to learn a bit more about? Are there sets of information that people have said to you that they've got potential, or there could be some really good bits of information in there? What are they? And then how do you start to learn more about them? How can you start to think, well, what are those tangible actions, those small little things that I can do in my day-to-day work that actually, they make us 5% or even 1% better? And ideally, if we can take those little actions and take those little steps, then the cumulative effort is going to be, ideally, a bigger change that we're going to be able to see down the track. So it's about going from the big picture ideas around data down to what is actually in my sphere of influence. And in that example I've shared with you, what's in my sphere of influence right now is quite simply just changing the cost of postage on my website. It's just one small thing that I know that I can do with the information that I've got. And so I'm encouraging you to think about a similar thing. What's the change in postage costs kind of equivalent in your work? As always, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Make Data Talk. If you found this useful, feel free to share. The newsletter will follow up always on LinkedIn the following week. So feel free to check that out and share that as well. And as always, stay safe and look after yourself.